There's someone in your life who remembers things you've completely forgotten. They remember what you ordered at a restaurant 2 years ago. They remember the offhand comment you made about your sister at a party you barely recall attending. They remember the exact tone in your voice when you said, "I'm fine," and they knew, even then, that you weren't. You probably assumed they just had a good memory, a sharp mind, maybe a gift. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if the brain that remembers everything, every small detail, every micro-expression, every word choice, isn't operating from talent? What if it's operating from fear? Because here's what the science actually reveals. When someone remembers every little thing about the people around them, it usually has nothing to do with intelligence. It has everything to do with what they survived. Let's start with how memory is actually supposed to work, because most people have it backwards. The human brain is not designed to remember everything. In fact, it's designed to forget. Forgetting is a feature, not a flaw. Your brain filters out the irrelevant, the color of the car that passed you this morning, the words your coworker used in a meeting last Tuesday, because holding on to everything would be overwhelming. Neuroscientists call this process synaptic pruning. The brain literally trims the connections it doesn't need. But some brains don't do this the same way. Some brains, particularly those shaped by unpredictable or emotionally unsafe environments, learn very early that details matter, that missing a shift in someone's mood can have consequences, that the small things are actually warnings. And so the brain starts logging everything, not as a gift, as a survival strategy. This is what psychologists call hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a state where the nervous system stays on low-level alert, constantly scanning the environment for threat signals. It's most commonly associated with trauma and anxiety disorders, but its milder expressions are far more widespread than most people realize. And one of its most fascinating, least discussed symptoms is exceptional social memory. When you grow up in an environment where you couldn't dare predict the people around you, a parent whose mood shifted without warning, a household where conflict appeared out of nowhere, a relationship where you were frequently criticized or dismissed, your brain responds by building a more detailed map of other people. Every facial expression becomes data. Every word choice becomes information. Every silence becomes something to decode. The child doing this isn't conscious of it. They're not thinking, "I should remember what Dad said this morning so I can prepare for tonight." The brain is doing it automatically, beneath awareness, building what researchers call a social threat detection system. And over time, that system becomes extraordinarily sensitive, extraordinarily accurate, and extraordinarily exhausting. Here's where it becomes something most people never consider. The people who remember everything about others often remember surprisingly little about themselves. Think about that for a moment. While their attention has been focused outward, mapping other people's preferences, moods, and patterns, their own inner life has frequently gone unexamined. They know your coffee order. They don't always know what they actually want for their own birthday. They can recall the exact phrase that hurt you in an argument 6 months ago. They sometimes struggle to identify what they themselves are feeling in the present moment. Psychologists who work with hypervigilant individuals frequently observe this asymmetry. The emotional attention flows outward as a form of protection. Tracking others keeps you safe. Tracking yourself feels less urgent, sometimes even threatening, because self-reflection can surface pain that the outward focus was quietly suppressing. But there's another layer here, and this one is important. Not everyone who remembers small details is operating from fear. Some people remember details because of something entirely different. Deep emotional investment, attachment. Psychological research on what's called relational attunement shows that people who feel a strong sense of connection to someone pay closer attention to them. The memory encoding is stronger because the emotional significance is higher. This is why you remember almost everything about your first love and almost nothing about your third coworker. Emotional salience acts like a spotlight. The brain records what the heart highlights. So there are actually two different kinds of people who remember everything about you. The first is running a protection system. They remember details because their nervous system never fully learned that it was safe to stop watching. The second is deeply, genuinely attached to you. They remember details because you matter to them in a way they may not even have the words to explain. What's fascinating, and sometimes heartbreaking, is that these two types can look identical from the outside, and they often coexist inside the same person. Now consider what happens when this person finally feels safe. For someone who built their social memory as a survival mechanism, there's a peculiar moment that can occur in relationships where real trust develops. They start to forget things, small things. They stop tracking every microshift in your tone. They stop rehearsing conversations in advance. And for them, this feels disorienting, almost wrong, because their nervous system, interpreted that constant vigilance as responsible, as caring, as love, learning to let the guard down, to let some details pass unrecorded, to exist in a relationship without needing to monitor it. That's not laziness for these individuals. That's healing. And it can take years. A landmark body of research on attachment theory, built upon the foundational work of John Bowlby and later expanded by researchers like Daniel Siegel in his work on interpersonal neurobiology, shows that early relational experiences literally shape the architecture of how our brains process social information. The patterns formed in childhood don't disappear. They go underground, and they resurface as personality traits that the world observes without understanding. So when you meet someone who remembers everything, who recalls the birthday of your cousin you mentioned once, who brings up something you said in a moment of vulnerability and holds it carefully, who notices when something is slightly off, even when you haven't said a word, pause before you reduce them to simply having a good memory. What you're often encountering is a brain that spent years learning how to read people because it had to. A nervous system that became extraordinarily attuned to the emotional weather of others because the alternative felt dangerous. A person who, in some very real sense, developed a form of emotional intelligence, not from a book or a workshop, but from necessity. And that's not a superpower. It's a story. The people who remember everything about you are rarely the ones thinking about how impressive their memory is. They're usually the ones quietly wondering if they remembered enough, if they missed something, if they read the room correctly, if they'll be caught off guard. What looks like a gift to the outside world often feels like a burden on the inside, a nervous system that hasn't quite received the message that the danger has passed. The most remarkable thing you can do for someone like this isn't to be impressed by what they remember. It's to make them feel safe enough to start forgetting. Because the brain that finally learns it doesn't need to remember everything, that it's and allowed to rest, to trust, to let some things go unrecorded. That brain isn't losing something. It's finding something it never quite had. Peace.